The great hall of the Alien Academy was wide and endless, with high walls of silver stone and cold blue light that poured down from the ceiling in tall lines like frozen waterfalls. The air was heavy with silence, except for the low hum of machines that floated near the corners. Rows of alien students filled the chamber, their bodies different in shape and size, yet all carried the same eager stare toward the front of the room where a tall figure stood. The instructor was long and thin with dark scales shining under the light, his golden eyes cold and sharp as knives. He spoke in a voice that echoed across the hall, and every word carried weight. Today, he said, you will learn the true weakness of humans. The words made the students lean forward, their faces glowing with cruel joy. On a large wall behind the teacher, a wide screen came alive, with images of human bodies drawn in bright lines, showing bones and muscles and organs in clear detail. The instructor raised a long finger and traced over the human chest, saying, look here, the cage of bone is thin, so a strike will break it. Look here, the lungs need air, and without air the human falls. Look here, the skull is soft, and the brain hides inside, waiting to be destroyed. The alien students laughed, some beating their hands against the tables, making the room thunder with noise. To them, it was a game. It was knowledge of how to break a fragile toy. But at the far end of the hall, away from the light and the noise, sat a single human. He was silent, his head lowered, his eyes hidden in shadow. No one spoke to him. No one cared to wonder why he was there. He was just a body, a fragile body in a room of predators. Yet as the alien laughter echoed, the human lifted his eyes just a little, and they were calm, not afraid, not broken, but waiting. The instructor continued with passion, his tail sweeping across the floor as he moved, saying, humans are slow, they need to rest after little effort. They cannot see well in the dark, they cannot hear the smallest sound, they cannot smell the hidden scent. A true hunter would never fear such prey. More laughter came, and more noise filled the room. Young aliens whispered to each other with wide grins, their sharp teeth glinting under the cold lights. One whispered, imagine facing such a creature on a battlefield, it would fall in seconds. Another whispered, imagine keeping one as a pet, it would not resist. The human at the back heard every word, and yet made no sound. His hands were folded before him, his breathing slow, steady, almost too steady. The stillness of a storm before the strike. The instructor clapped his hands, and the screen changed, now showing holograms of human soldiers, small compared to the wide forms of alien warriors. The image showed battles where humans bled where they fell to the ground. The instructor spoke with pride, saying, see how easily they are defeated, see how the blade cuts them, see how they beg for air, see how they fall. The students hissed with excitement, their tails and limbs tapping against the floor in rhythm like drums of war. The sound rose like a storm of arrogance. In the middle of the storm, the human remained quiet, his face still unreadable. Some of the younger aliens began to notice him, their eyes narrowing in curiosity. They leaned to each other, whispering, is he afraid? Does he feel shame? Does he sit there knowing he is nothing? One dared to laugh louder, pointing with a claw, and saying, look, the prey has come to hear how weak it is. The class roared again, but the human did not turn his head. He did not answer. Instead, his eyes stayed on the teacher, his gaze steady as a mountain. The silence of that gaze was louder than all their laughter. The instructor lifted his voice again, saying, to kill a human is simple. You strike the chest, you take away the air, you strike the head, and the body will end. The alien students wrote notes with eager claws scratching on their glowing pads. They believed every word. They believed the lesson was truth carved in stone. The human listened and said nothing. The room was a storm of noise, but around the human there was a circle of quiet, an invisible barrier of calm. It made some of the aliens shift in their seats, though they did not understand why. It made the light around him seem sharper, the shadows deeper. The instructor turned, and for the first time his golden eyes looked toward the back of the room, toward the human. The hall fell into a softer silence, waiting. The instructor said, you sit there, you hear my words, do you deny them? But the human did not move. He only lowered his eyes again, as if choosing patience over pride. The class laughed at his silence, taking it as surrender. The instructor turned away, pleased. He raised his hand and spoke of more human weaknesses, of fragile skin, of fear, of pain, of tears. The lesson was meant to break the image of humans into nothing but prey. The students listened and laughed, and celebrated the thought. Yet the human waited. His silence was not surrender, but a seed hidden deep under the soil, waiting for the right time to break the ground. His eyes lifted once more, only for a second, and in that second, they burned with something the aliens could not name, a fire not of muscle, not of bone, but of will. And though the laughter of the aliens roared again, and the lesson went on, the shadow of that fire remained in the room, and it was a shadow that no one would forget. The alien instructor moved across the front of the chamber, his long claws tapping against the floor like knives scratching on stone. The screen behind him shifted again, now showing close images of human bodies with glowing marks drawn across the chest, the throat, the stomach, the skull, each mark bright red and sharp as if carved by fire. He spoke with growing pride, saying, "These are the points of weakness. These are the doors to death for humans. Strike the chest, and the lungs will drown in blood. Strike the throat, and the air will vanish. Strike the skull, and the mind will shatter." The words carried across the chamber, heavy and cruel. The students leaned forward, their faces filled with hunger. One young alien whispered to his seat, "Mate, so simple, so fragile, so weak." Another whispered, "It is not even a challenge." The sound of cruel laughter echoed again, filling the space like rolling thunder. And still the human sat in the back, silent, calm, waiting, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. More closely than any of them, his eyes sharp though half hidden under the dim light, his body still like stone, but his breath slow, steady, and never breaking. The silence around him grew heavier with each word spoken by the instructor. The alien teacher pointed to another image, a glowing outline of a human soldier, carrying a weapon. The figure looked small next to the wide and powerful alien form drawn beside it. He said, "The human may carry tools, but the tool is nothing without power. The hand is weak, the strike is soft, the weapon falls if the body fails." The students hissed and laughed. One of them raised a claw and said, "Why do they even fight if they are so weak?" Another said, "Perhaps they do not understand how frail they are." The teacher smiled with sharp teeth and replied, "They fight because they hope, and hope is nothing more than a dream of prey before the teeth of a hunter." The hall filled with cruel joy again, but not all eyes were laughing now, for some began to look once more at the human who sat still at the back. His silence was beginning to whisper louder than their words. The instructor paced slowly back and forth, his scales glimmering under the pale light. He raised his claw and said, "Watch carefully, for I will now show you how simple it is to end a human life." He called forward a tall alien youth from the front row, one eager to prove himself. The youth stepped with pride, his chest wide, his fangs gleaming. He bowed to the teacher and faced the hall. The teacher said, "Show them how easy it is to strike the weak points." The young alien nodded and turned toward the screen. He moved his claw with speed, pointing at the glowing chest of the human figure on the screen. He said, "Here the heart is soft, here the cage is thin, one strike breaks it." He slashed his claw through the air with a hiss. Then he moved his claw to the throat and said, "Here one slice and no more air." Again a hiss as his claw cut through the empty space. The students cheered, slamming claws on tables in wild rhythm. The young alien grinned with pride. He turned to the teacher, who nodded with approval. But then the young alien's eyes shifted toward the back of the hall where the human sat alone. A grin spread across his face. He said, "Perhaps we should test the lesson on the real thing." The class fell silent for a moment, then broke into wild laughter, cheering and chanting, "Yes, yes, test him, test him." The human did not move. His hands rested calmly in his lap, his shoulders straight, his breathing steady. The young alien began to walk toward him, claws gleaming, eyes bright with arrogance. The students leaned forward in excitement, their voices rising like a storm. The instructor allowed at his golden eyes, watching with interest, for he believed the display would prove his lesson beyond doubt. The young alien stopped before the human towering over him with a cruel smile. He bent forward and whispered in a voice filled with scorn, "Are you ready to show your weakness, little human?" The hall roared with cruel laughter, but the human raised his eyes slowly, his gaze calm and steady, and for a brief moment, the young alien hesitated, though he did not understand why. The silence of that gaze cut sharper than any blade. Yet pride pushed him forward. He raised his claw high, aiming for the human chest. The hall went silent, waiting for the strike. And in that breathless moment, the human moved. It was not the slow, fragile movement they expected, but a sudden, precise motion faster than the eyes of many could follow. The claw was caught, twisted, pulled. The young alien stumbled, his balance broken in an instant. Before he could recover, the human's hand pressed against his throat, firm, unshaking. The weapon that had gleamed in the alien's hand now rested in the human's grip. The Hall gasped, a single breath held by every throat. The young alien lay pinned on the ground, his eyes wide in shock, his pride shattered like glass. The human looked down at him with calm eyes, breathing steady, as if nothing had changed. The silence in the hall was deeper than before, heavier than stone. The instructor's eyes narrowed, his golden gaze sharp but unreadable. He said nothing. The students stared in disbelief, their claws frozen above the tables, their laughter gone, their whispers silent. The human released the young alien, slowly letting him stumble back to his feet. The weapon still rested in the human's hand, but he lowered it, his voice unspoken, his gaze steady. Then he placed the weapon gently on the floor and returned to his stillness, as if nothing had happened. The hall remained silent. No one dared to laugh, no one dared to cheer. They only stared at the human with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw prey, but something they could not yet name. And though the instructor spoke again, trying to pull their attention back to the glowing screen, his voice no longer carried the same power. For the students now knew something had shifted in the air, something they did not yet understand. The lesson was not as simple as they had thought. The silence of the human had become a shadow across the hall, a shadow that whispered of danger hidden inside the fragile body they had mocked. A shadow that promised the truth was not what the teacher had said. And though none of them spoke it aloud, each one felt a weight pressing on their hearts. A weight that said perhaps the lesson had only just begun. The chamber was still heavy with silence, the sound of the young alien gasping for breath still echoing faint in the corners. The instructor raised his voice, trying to restore order, his claws slicing the air, as he declared this was nothing more than luck, nothing more than a trick of timing. He said the body of a human remains weak, the bones remain thin, the skin remains soft, the mind remains simple. He tried to make the students laugh again, but their laughter was thin and nervous. Their eyes kept returning to the human, who now sat calm. Once more his hands folded, his gaze lowered, yet burning with something they could not define. The silence around him was no longer the silence of prey, but the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. And it pressed heavy on every student who sat there. One bold student stood, his scales bright red, his fangs sharp with youth and pride. He slammed his claw against the table and shouted, "Let me show them that the human is weak. Let me prove the lesson true." The instructor allowed it, for he wished to restore his authority and silence the shadow of doubt that had begun to spread across the hall. The red-scaled alien rose and strode toward the human, his steps loud against the cold floor. He said loudly before the class, "Look at him, sitting small and silent. Watch how quickly I will break him." The others cheered, though their voices shook. The instructor watched with golden eyes narrowing. The human lifted his gaze once more, slow, steady, his eyes meeting the eyes of the challenger without fear. The red-scaled alien hissed and lunged forward, his claws flashing like blades. The strike came fast, meant to pierce the chest, but again the human moved with sudden precision. His body twisted, his hand struck the wrist of the alien, bending it aside with ease. The claw missed, and the red-scaled alien stumbled. Before he could recover, the human's shoulder pressed forward, knocking the breath from him. The alien fell backward, sprawling on the floor. The hall gasped again, their voices caught in their throats. The human stood for a moment, not tall, not strong in appearance, yet unshaken, his chest rising slowly, his eyes steady. He bent down, lifted the weapon that had fallen from the red-scaled alien's grip, then placed it back into the alien's hands, and returned to his seat without a word. The silence was deeper than before, now filled with fear. The instructor growled, his voice harder, now his pride cut by the sight before him. He shouted, "Enough, these tricks are nothing more than chance. The human will fall when faced with true power." He turned to the class and called for another student, larger, older, more skilled than the first two, a warrior already strong in training. The chosen alien stood tall, his frame wide like stone, his claws long and thick. He walked with slow steps toward the human, his face calm, yet filled with cruel intent. The hall waited, holding its breath as he stopped before the human. He raised his claw not with haste, but with slow certainty, as if the prey before him could not escape. The human lifted his eyes once more, and for the first time his lips moved, though only slightly. He spoke so softly that only the nearest students heard. He said, "Strike when ready." The words were calm, without pride, without fear. The large alien snarled and thrust forward with all his weight, his claw cutting the air with speed and power. Yet again the human moved his hand, caught the wrist, twisted it down. His knee struck the alien's chest. The larger frame stumbled backward in shock. Before he could strike again, the human's hand had already pressed against his throat, firm, steady, unshaking. The hall was frozen again. The large alien gasped his pride, broken his body lower to the floor. The human released him as gently as before and stepped back, returning to his stillness. The hall was filled with whispers, but none dared to laugh. The instructor now burned with anger, his golden eyes sharp with fury. He shouted, "You see only tricks, you see only chance, but chance cannot save him from the truth of weakness." He tried to raise the voices of the class again, but their eyes were changed. Their whispers carried not scorn but doubt. One whispered, "Perhaps the teacher is wrong." Another whispered, "Perhaps humans are not as weak as we were told." The silence of the human had become a question that no one could answer. The instructor slammed his claws against the table at the front of the hall to sound like thunder. He declared the human cannot win against many. The human cannot stand against true numbers. He raised his voice to the ceiling and shouted, "Who among you will show this truth?" A group of 5 young aliens rose, their eyes burning with pride. They shouted together, "We will, we will." The hall shook with nervous cries as they stepped forward, surrounding the human from every side. The instructor pointed and shouted, "Show them that the human is nothing." The 5 moved in closer, claws raised, eyes, sharp breaths heavy. The human sat still for a moment longer, then slowly rose to his feet. His movements calm as body, steady, his eyes sharp as blades. The silence before the storm grew heavy in the hall, every student leaning forward, their claws tight against their seats, their hearts pounding with expectation. The 5 aliens struck together, their claws slicing through the air from every side, their voices hissing with fury. But the human moved not with strength, but with precision. He bent low, letting one claw pass. Above him, his legs swept the feet of another, sending him crashing to the floor. He twisted aside from another strike, grabbing the arm of the attacker and pulling it into the path of the second claw. The two collided with pain and confusion. The human spun with grace, his elbow striking another in the chest, sending him stumbling. In moments, the 5 were scattered on the floor, their claws fallen, their pride shattered. The human stood in the center, breathing hard, but his eyes calm, his hands steady, his body still strong. He looked at them with quiet fire, then lowered himself back to his seat, as if the storm had never come. The hall was filled with silence, so deep it felt alive. The students stared wide-eyed, their hearts shaken, their faith broken. The instructor stood frozen, his golden eyes burning, but his voice lost for the first time, and in that silence the human waited again, his patience endless, his fire hidden yet unshaken. The class knew now that something was wrong with everything they had been taught. The lesson of weakness was breaking before their eyes, and the shadow of the human grew long across the hall, promising that the truth they had learned was nothing but a lie. The great hall of the Alien Academy was heavy with silence. The 5 young warriors who had fallen still lay across the cold floor, breathing hard, their claws trembling, their eyes wide with disbelief. The other students sat frozen in their seats, unsure if they should speak or remain quiet. The instructor stood tall, his golden eyes burning, but his voice caught, for he had no words that could break the shadow now stretching across the chamber. The human remained seated, calm and still, yet there was no weakness in his silence, only patience, only a storm waiting beneath the surface. Then at last he lifted his head, and his voice came soft and steady, carrying through the hall like water flowing over stone. He said, "You studied the body, but you never studied the mind." Every alien ear twitched at his words, for it was the first time the human had spoken since the lesson began, and his voice was calm, without fear, without anger, yet sharp enough to cut through the walls of pride that had been built around the students. He rose from his seat, moving slowly, yet with strength in every step, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the students who stared at him in silence. He said, you believe that breaking bone ends a man, you believe that closing the throat ends the fight, you believe that striking the skull ends the will, but you are wrong. He stepped closer to the front of the hall, and every student followed his movement with their eyes unable to look away. He said, the body of a human is not strong, the body of a human is not armored, the body of a human is not fast. But the will of a human is not held by bone or by skin or by breath. The will of a human is carried by something you cannot see and cannot cut. His voice grew sharper, but not louder, his calm breaking in a fire. He said, we endure, we adapt, we learn, we become stronger. Through pain, we rise again after every fall. He pointed toward the great screen where the images of human weakness still glowed. He said, you see lungs that need air, yet you do not see how long a human can run without rest, chasing prey for days until it falls. You see a chest that can be pierced, yet you do not see how a human will keep moving even when wounded. You see a skull that can break, yet you do not see how humans build tools from stone and fire to turn weakness into strength. The room was silent, but the silence was no longer filled with arrogance. It was filled with unease and doubt. The students shifted in their seats, their eyes wide, their claws still. The instructor tried to speak, but no sound came out. His golden eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. The human turned his gaze to him and said, you spoke of fear, you spoke of pain, you spoke of death, but you did not speak of what lies beyond. You did not speak of the stubborn fire that does not end. He stepped closer to the group of students at the front who still sat frozen, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on him. He said, you believe strength is claw and tooth, you believe strength is armor and speed, but strength is something else. Strength is to keep moving when the body is broken. Strength is to keep fighting when the air is gone. Strength is to keep rising when the ground itself pulls you down. He spread his hands, showing them the scars that lined his skin, faint but visible under the pale light. He said, these are not marks of weakness. They are marks of battles survived. They are proof that pain did not end me. The student stared at the scars with wide eyes. He said, you have never studied this, you have never been taught this, because it cannot be written on a screen, it cannot be cut into flesh, it can only be lived. The hall remained silent, but now it was not the silence of scorn, it was the silence of listening. Even the machines that hummed in the corners seemed quieter, as if the room itself leaned closer to hear. The human lowered his hands, and his voice softened. Once more he said, you laugh at tears, but tears are not weakness, they are proof of feeling, and feeling gives reason to rise. You laugh at pain, but pain is not the end, it is the teacher that shapes strength. You laugh at death, but death itself does not come easy to a human, for even at the edge we claw, and we fight, and we refuse to fall. His words carried like stone across water, breaking every ripple of pride within the alien hearts. The students looked at one another, their faces uneasy, their eyes filled with questions they had never dared to ask before. The instructor finally found his voice sharp and loud. He shouted, enough. This is nothing more than words, nothing more than tricks. You are prey, nothing more than prey. But the human did not flinch. His calm remained steady, his gaze sharp. He said, if you believe my words are empty, then test them again, and again test them until your doubt is broken. The students shifted, some leaning forward as if ready to rise again, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. The human turned slowly, walking back toward the place where he had first sat. He lowered himself with calm grace, his hands folding before him. He said, you see my weakness, but you cannot see my strength because it does not live in the body, it lives in the will. His words hung heavy in the air, and the hall remained quiet once more. Not a single alien laughed, not a single alien whispered. The silence was complete, and inside that silence the truth had begun to grow. The truth that the lesson was a lie, the truth that the human was not prey, the truth that they were staring at something far more dangerous than they had ever been taught to believe. The hall of the Alien Academy was quiet, yet heavy, the silence thick, as if the air itself had turned to stone. Every student sat still, their claws resting against the glowing tables, their eyes wide and uneasy, their laughter gone. The human had spoken, and his words still lingered in the chamber like echoes that could not be erased. The instructor stood tall, but his golden eyes no longer carried the same fire. His jaw was set hard, as if holding back the weight of doubt. The human remained calm, his body still, his breath steady. Then slowly he rose once more from his seat, his movements quiet yet strong, his eyes sharp yet patient. He bent down and picked up the weapon that still lay on the floor from the fallen students. With simple hands, he began to take the weapon apart piece by piece, every motion careful and precise. The students leaned forward, their eyes following his hands, for none could look away. He spoke in a voice calm and measured as he worked. He said, "You see a weapon in you. Believe its power lies in the steel, but the true power lies in the hands that hold it and the mind that guides it." Piece by piece, he laid the weapon across the table, the blade, the hilt, the core, the binding. He said, "Humans learn fast. We take apart what we do not understand, and we build it again, stronger, sharper, more suited to the fight." He lifted one piece, showing it under the cold blue light. He said, "This is not strength by itself. This is only metal, but when joined with the will of a human, it becomes more than metal. It becomes survival." The students whispered to one another, their eyes wide, their voices uneasy. The human placed the pieces down again with quiet patience and spoke. He said, "You laugh at weakness because you believe strength is born, but humans are not born strong. We are born fragile, yet we rise, we adapt, we make tools, we turn the world itself into our armor." He raised his scarred hands, showing them once more. He said, "Every scar is a lesson, every wound a teacher, every loss a seed of cunning." He stepped closer to the glowing screen where images of human weakness still lingered. With a steady hand, he pointed at the image of lungs and said, "Yes, our lungs can fail, but you do not see the long breath of hunters who run for days until prey collapses from exhaustion." He pointed at the chest and said, "Yes, our hearts can break, but you do not see how a soldier will crawl through mud bleeding and broken, yet still move forward to strike again." He pointed at the skull and said, "Yes, the head can shatter, but you do not see how the mind within refuses to bend, refuses to yield, refuses to end." The students shifted in their seats, some lowering their heads, some clutching their claws together with unease, for his words struck deeper than any blade, and they felt the fire behind them. The human spoke of deserts where the sun burned without mercy, yet men walked for miles without rest. He spoke of frozen lands where storms howled, yet tribes built fire and shelter from nothing. He spoke of mountains higher than the sky that men climbed with bare hands. He spoke of oceans where humans dived into the deep dark for food and treasure. He said, "We are not strong, but we endure. We are not armored, but we adapt. We are not fast, but we chase until faster things collapse." His voice grew sharper as he said, "We are not the kings of strength, but we are the kings of stubbornness, and stubbornness is the root of all victory." The instructor tried to raise his voice again, shouting that these were only stories, that humans glorified themselves with tales of survival. But his voice no longer commanded the same power, for the students no longer cheered, no longer laughed. They only stared at the human with eyes that saw something their teacher had never told them. The human looked at the instructor with calm fire and said, "You call them stories, but they are history carved in blood and stone. They are not dreams, they are scars that live on our skin." He turned again to the students and said, "Every one of us carries the memory of battles with beasts larger and stronger than us. Every one of us carries the memory of winters that try to kill us, storms that try to drown us, lands that try to bury us. And still we lived." He spread his arms wide, his voice steady and deep. He said, "We're not meant to be here by chance. We are here because we refuse to die." The students began to whisper louder, their eyes no longer filled with arrogance, but with awe and unease. One whispered, "How can such fragile bodies survive such trials?" Another whispered, "Perhaps the weakness is only what we see, not what is." Another whispered, "If this is true, then they're not prey, they're something else." The human lowered his arms and stepped back, his voice softer. Once more he said, "You call us weak, because you see the outside, you see flesh, you see bone, but you do not see the inside. And what cannot be measured by your screens, what cannot be cut with your claws, what cannot be ended by a single strike, is the fire that rises when the body falls, and as long as remains, the human will rise again." He returned the weapon pieces to the table, assembling them once more with quiet ease, his hands steady, his breath calm. In moments the weapon was whole again, shining under the cold light. He placed it back gently and folded his hands. He said, "You studied our weakness, but you did not study our strength." The hall remained silent again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of laughter held back. It was the silence of fear, respect, and awakening. The students sat still, their eyes drawn to the human, as if seeing him for the first time. The instructor clenched his claws, his pride wounded, his lesson broken. And in the center of that heavy silence, the human waited, his fire hidden, but his truth now burning in every heart of the aliens who had come to learn how to kill his kind, but instead had begun to learn how impossible that task would ever truly be. The Alien Academy Hall was filled with silence, the kind of silence that grows heavy and alive, pressing against the skin of every student seated at their tables. The human stood in the center of the chamber, his hands calm, his breath steady, his scars glowing faint under the cold light above. The instructor glared with golden eyes, sharp as blades, his pride shattered, his voice heavy with anger. He shouted, "Enough words, enough stories. Let us see truth with claws and blood. Let us see if this human dares to face more than tricks." His tail slammed against the floor with a thunderous crack, and the sound echoed through the hall like a drum of war. He turned to the rows of young warriors and demanded, "Who among you will rise to test him, who will prove that human weakness is real?" The room trembled with uneasy energy. The students glanced at one another, their faces torn between pride and fear. Finally, 5 stood tall, their scales shimmering under the cold blue light, their eyes filled with burning arrogance. They shouted together, "We will, we will," their voices strong though their hearts uncertain. The human lifted his head, his gaze calm. He said in a soft voice, "Come then." The words carried like stone across still water, every ear catching them, every chest feeling them. The 5 aliens spread around him, forming a circle, their claws raised, their bodies crouched, ready to strike. The instructor grinned with cruel joy, his voice sharp as he shouted, "Now, let the lesson be carved in truth." The hall held its breath, the students leaning forward, claws pressed against tables, hearts pounding. The silence stretched like a bow pulled tight, then snapped as the 5 lunged together, their bodies fast, their claws cutting the air. But the human did not meet them with strength. He met them with patience and cunning. His body moved with speed born of instinct, and while his feet shifting, his hands quick as lightning. The first claw slashed where his chest had been, but he bent low, sweeping his leg across the floor. The attacker fell hard with a hiss. Another struck from the left, but the human seized, his wrist twisting it aside with sudden force, pulling him forward into the path of a third attacker. Claws collided with flesh. The 2 cried out in shock. The human spun with grace, his elbow striking the chest of a fourth, sending him stumbling backward, his breath broken. The 5th leapt with fury from behind, but the human turned with calm, eyes catching the arm and pulling him forward to crash against the ground. In moments, the 5, who had risen with pride, now lay scattered around him there. Weapons fallen, their claws trembling, their eyes wide with disbelief. The hall gasped as one soundless breath, every student staring with wide eyes, their pride breaking, their faith shaking. The instructor's grin faltered, his golden eyes narrowing sharp with fury. The human stood among the fallen, his chest rising with breath, yet his stance still steady, his eyes sharp, his voice calm. He said, "This is human weakness. We bleed, we suffer, we fall, but we do not stop." He stepped over the fallen warriors and walked toward the front of the hall, his movements steady, his presence heavy. He said, "You believe strength is the power to strike once and end a fight, but true strength is the will to stand again and again when the fight does not end." He turned his gaze to the students, his voice cutting the silence like fire across dry grass. He said, "You strike us down, and we rise, you wound us, and we endure, you bury us, and we dig our way back to the light. That is the truth your teacher did not tell you. That is the truth no claw can break." The instructor slammed his claw against the table, once more his voice loud, yet trembling with hidden doubt. He shouted, "Lies, all lies. A single human cannot defeat the will of a world. A single fragile body cannot stand against true armies." But his voice no longer carried the same fire it once had, for the eyes of his students betrayed him. Their eyes were no longer filled with laughter, no longer filled with arrogance. They were filled with unease and awakening. The human turned to him, his voice steady as stone. He said, "You see a single body and think it stands alone, but every human carries the spirit of those who came before. Every human carries the lessons of pain and struggle, of fire and blood, of triumph against the impossible. When one stands, he carries the strength of thousands behind him, and when thousands stand together, no force can erase them." His words flowed like rivers carving through stone, unshaken, unstoppable, undeniable. The fallen five rose slowly to their knees, their pride, broken their breaths, ragged their eyes wide with fear and respect. They no longer hissed, they no longer mocked, they looked at the human, as if seeing not prey but predator. The students shifted in their seats, their claws restless, their hearts uneasy. Some whispered to themselves, their voices trembling, saying he is not weak, saying we're never told this, saying what else have we been taught that was not truth. The human lowered his arms, his body still calm, though his chest rose with hard breath from the struggle. He looked across the hall with steady eyes and said, "This is not the end of your lesson. This is only the beginning." The hall was silent again, but the silence now held not only fear, but also awe. The silence of those who know they are standing before something they cannot yet name, but cannot deny. The instructor bared his teeth, his voice sharp with desperation. He shouted, "Do not believe him. Do not let his tricks blind you." But the fire his words no longer spread the way it once had. The students heard his voice, but their eyes stayed locked on the human. The human turned back to his seat and lowered himself with calm grace, folding his hands together once more as if nothing had happened. His silence was no longer emptiness. It was power. It was storm. It was truth. The students could not look away. They could not forget what they had seen and what they had heard. The instructor stood frozen, caught between fury and fear. And in the heavy silence of that hall, the human waited again, his fire hidden, but alive, ready to burn brighter in the final lesson that was yet to come. The alien academy hall was filled with silence deeper than the void of space. The young warriors who had fallen now sat back in their places, their claws shaking, their eyes refusing to meet the gaze of the human who had defeated them with such calm and quiet fire. The students whispered in fear, their voices thin as smoke, saying, "He is not weak," saying, "We did not know," saying, "The lesson is broken." The instructor stood at the front of the hall, his golden eyes burning, yet dimmed by doubt, his voice caught in his throat. He had tried to show the fragility of man, yet every attempt had broken before the patience of the human, who now sat once more with folded hands and steady breath. The silence stretched long, heavy with truth that could not be denied. At last the human rose again, and I turned to him, unable to look away, his presence filling the hall like a rising storm. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the cold floor, his scars glowing faint beneath the pale light. His voice came soft yet strong, steady as stone, cutting through the silence with ease. He said, "You came here to learn how to kill a human, and you were taught that the body is weak, that the bones break, and the lungs fail, that the heart stops, and the mind shatters. You were taught that we are prey, that we are fragile, that we are nothing. But you have seen now that the lesson was a lie." His words flowed slow and heavy, and each one struck the hearts of the students, leaving no space for doubt. He said, "You saw me fall, none. You saw me bleed, none. You saw me stop, none. You saw that weakness is not the end. You saw that endurance is strength. You saw that was fire that does not fade." He turned his eyes to the instructor and said, "You called me prey, but prey does not rise against predator. Prey does not adapt. Prey does not fight back until the hunter bleeds. Prey does not turn the world into a weapon. We are not prey. We are the storm that hunts, even when broken. We are the fire that rises, even when drowned. We are the will that endures, even when crushed." The instructor hissed, his tail slamming against the floor, his voice trembling with fury and desperation. He shouted, "Silence here. Words are poison, your words are tricks." But the students no longer listened to him. Their eyes remained fixed on the human, their ears filled only with his voice. The human stepped closer, his presence heavy, his voice calm. He said, "You laugh at our pain, but pain is our teacher. You laugh at our tears, but tears are our memory. You laugh at our scars, but scars are our strength. You call us fragile, yet fragility is not the same as weakness. Fragility is the shell that hides stubbornness unending." His eyes swept across the rows of students, and none dared to meet them directly, for the weight of his gaze was sharp as a blade and heavy as a mountain. He said, "You studied weakness, but you never studied strength, and now you will not forget." The instructor tried once more to speak, but his voice faltered under the weight of silence that followed the human. His golden eyes narrowed, his claws clenched, but he did not step forward, he did not strike. He saw that the lesson he had built over years had crumbled in a single day under the patience of one human who had spoken little and moved less, yet had broken everything with truth carved not in words alone, but in scars and fire. The students now looked to him, not with laughter, not with scorn, but with fear and respect. One whispered, "He is stronger than all of us." Another whispered, "His strength is not in his body, but in something we cannot touch." Another whispered, "If this is one human, then what of many?" The human stood tall now, in the center of the chamber, his arms lowered, his voice calm. He said, "You came here to learn to kill us, but instead you have learned why we live. You came here to study weakness, but instead you have seen strength. You came here to laugh at prey, but instead you have looked into the eyes of a predator." He stepped slowly toward the great doors at the end of the hall, and with each step the sound of his feet echoed like thunder. The students remained frozen, their claws pressed against the tables, their eyes wide with awe. The instructor lowered his head in silence, for even he could no longer deny the truth. The human paused before the door, his shadow long across the chamber. He turned his head slightly, his eyes burning with quiet fire. He said, "Remember this lesson, for it will follow you always. You may wound us, you may break us, you may bury us, but you will never erase us." He opened the door, the light from the corridor spilling into the hall, his figure framed in the glow, his shadow stretching long and sharp across the floor. Without another word, he stepped through the door, his footsteps fading slowly into the distance. The silence in the hall remained heavy, every student staring at the place where he had stood, their hearts trembling, their pride shattered. The instructor raised his head, slowly, his voice low, filled with shame. He whispered, "We were wrong." And though his words were soft, the entire hall heard them, and they carried the final weight of the broken lesson. The last sound was the echo of the human steps fading into silence, leaving behind a hall no longer filled with laughter, no longer filled with scorn, but filled with fear, with respect, and with truth. In the hearts of every alien student there burned a single thought that would never leave them. The thought that they had studied weakness, but had seen strength instead. The thought that humanity could not be broken by claws or teeth or lies. The thought that when the day came and battle rose, they would not face fragile prey. They would face a storm wrapped in flesh of fire, carried by will of force that could fall 1,000 times and still rise again. The hall grew quiet, the lesson ended, but the shadow of the human remained carved into every heart as a truth that would never die.